What Gandalf saw beneath Moria, that frightened him more than the Balrog. Here is what nobody tells you about the fall of Gandalf. Not the fall from the bridge, not the plunge into the dark water below Khazad-dûm, not the 10 days of fighting through cavern and fire, and finally out onto the peak of Xiraxagil, where the battle ended under open sky. Everyone knows that story. The movies made it visual. The books made it legendary. Gandalf fell. Gandalf fought. Gandalf died and was sent back. That is the version most people carry. But there is another story inside that one. A quieter story. A story Tolkien embedded in the seams of the text, the way Melkor embedded his discord in the bones of the world, deep enough that you have to go looking for it deliberately. And once you find it, once you actually follow Gandalf down into those depths and read carefully what he says about what he found there, the official story stops being a tale of heroic sacrifice and starts being something else entirely, something closer to a warning. This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. Everything that follows comes from the text, from the Silmarillion, from unfinished tales, from the letters, from the precise and deliberate way Tolkien described a 10-day battle that he could have summarized in a paragraph, but instead chose to frame with specific geological language that has never been adequately explained. The evidence is all there. It has just been waiting for someone to go deep enough to find it. So, when Gandalf said he had passed through fire and deep water, was he describing what he survived? Or was he warning us about what he left sealed down there? Let us find out. The place to start is not with the Balrog. It is with a single line that appears before the Balrog ever shows itself, spoken in the dark of Moria while the Fellowship is still moving, while there is still a chance they might get through without a fight. Tolkien writes it quietly, almost as an aside, barely drawing attention to it. Gandalf says, "There are older and fouler things than orcs in the deep places of the world." Everyone nods past that line. Everyone assumes it refers to the Balrog. It is the most natural assumption in the world, and it is almost certainly wrong. Think about what Gandalf already knows at this point. He has suspected for years that something great and terrible survived in Moria. Tolkien tells us in Unfinished Tales that Gandalf was the one who encouraged Thorin Oakenshield toward the quest of Erebor, partly as a strategic move against Sauron, but also because he was already anxious about what lay dormant in the mountains of Middle-earth. He knows the history. He knows that Moria was lost not to simple orc incursion, but to something the dwarves woke when they delved too deep. Balin's expedition, which failed and died in those tunnels not long before the Fellowship arrived, confirmed it. Gandalf knows there is a Balrog. He has probably known for centuries that there is a Balrog. So when he says older and fouler things, he is not talking about the Balrog. He is talking about something else. Pay attention to this, because this is the door the whole script walks through. The Balrog of Moria, whose name Tolkien gives in various sources as Durin's Bane, is a Maya, a spirit of the Order of Ainur who was corrupted by Melkor before the shaping of Arda, who fell with him and served in his wars, who was at Angband during the catastrophes of the First Age, and who fled when Thangorodrim was broken, and fled downward into the deep places of the mountains, and stayed there, hid there, dormant for thousands of years while the ages turned above it. That is strange, if you think about it. Not the hiding. The hiding makes sense. A hunted thing goes to ground. But the duration is extraordinary. The War of Wrath that ended the First Age and broke Thangorodrim happened more than 5,000 years before the Fellowship walked into Moria. 5,000 years of dormancy. 5,000 years in the dark, alone, without a master to serve, without a purpose, without the structure of a Dark Lord's will to give it shape. Tolkien tells us in Letter 156 that the Balrog had lain hidden since that fall of Thangorodrim. He is specific about that. He is telling us the Balrog was down there, in those depths, for 5,000 years, waiting, or perhaps not waiting. Perhaps simply existing, in the way that very old things exist when there is nothing left for them to do, sustained by the stone around it, by the deep places that had sheltered it. But what sustained it? That question has no canonical answer, and that absence is exactly where the lore opens into something vast and dark and worth following. Because here is what the Silmarillion tells us about those deep places. The Ainulindale, the account of the creation of Arda that opens the Silmarillion, is not a metaphor. Tolkien was not writing myth in the classical sense, where the stories are understood as symbolic. He was writing what he called the cosmological truth of his world, the actual metaphysical mechanics of how Arda came to be and what it is made of. And what the Ainulindale tells us is that the world was made from the music, from the great song that the Ainur sang before Ilúvatar, and that Melkor's discord was woven into that music before the world took shape. The corruption of Melkor is not something that happened to Arda. It is something Arda was partly built from. Picture this: before the sun rose, before the first star was lit, before anything that breathed had opened its eyes, Melkor was already in the bones of the world, tunneling, pouring cold into the deep places and heat into others, twisting the intended geometry of the earth, building Utumno in the uttermost north, before Ilúvatar's children ever came to be. Tolkien describes it as geological violence, as the deliberate deformation of the world's intended shape. Mountains where there should have been plains, seas where there should have been shores, cold where the music had planned warmth, and beneath all of it, carved into the literal substance of stone, the record of that violence. Not merely the ruins Melkor left behind, the damage itself, structural, embedded, never removed. When Utumno was broken in the War of the Powers, when the Valar came with their armies and unmade the first dark fortress, what happened to what Melkor had put into the stone? The answer Tolkien gives is, not much. The Valar healed what they could see. They reshaped the surface of the world. They chained Melkor. But the depths were another matter. The depths were beyond what anyone was willing to go. The deepest corruption, the oldest twisted channels of Melkor's will that had been poured into the rock of Arda in the world's first age, those remained, sealed by stone above, untouched, as close to permanent as anything in Tolkien's world gets. This is not speculation. This is Tolkien's cosmological framework, Arda Mard. A world built partly from a false note in the music, carrying that false note in its geology, the way bone carries old fractures. And now ask yourself what that means for a place like Moria. Khazad-dûm sits in the misty mountains, which Tolkien tells us in the Silmarillion were raised by Melkor himself in the earliest days of the world, built as a barrier against the Valar, raised quickly and badly, mountains formed by geological malice rather than the intended order of the music. The misty mountains are not natural in the way that natural even means anything in Tolkien's world. They are Melkor's handiwork. The stone of those mountains carries, at its deepest levels, the signature of his making, and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm delved into the heart of those mountains. Deeper and deeper, generation after generation, following the veins of Mithril. Tolkien tells us in Letter 144 that the dwarves were resistant to corruption in the way of overt domination, that Sauron's attempts to control them through the rings of power largely failed because they were too stubborn, too inward, too obsessively focused on their craft to be easily bent. But that same stubbornness, that same obsessive focus on what was below them, drove them deeper than any people of Middle-earth had gone before. And in going deeper, they were also going older. Going back through the geological layers, toward the time when the mountains were first raised, and what Melkor left in the raising was still close to the surface, geologically speaking. Now here is where it gets strange. Tolkien's note in Letter 144 is brief but specific. The dwarves delved too deep, and the thing they woke was not merely the Balrog. He says the mithril veins led them into evil. That word, evil, not danger, not a monster. Evil, as a property of what they were moving toward, embedded in the rock itself. And here is what that actually means. The deepest delvings of Khazad-dûm were not just a mine, they were a passage into the geological record of the First Age. A descent through 5,000 years of sealed stone into strata that had never been opened since Melkor first touched them, and when the dwarves opened those strata, they did not just find the Balrog, they found what the Balrog had been living in. What had been sustaining it, the ambient corruption in the stone around it, which had kept a powerful spiritual being alive and coherent through 5 millennia of dormancy, without a master, without a purpose, without the organizational structure of a Dark Lord's will. Something in those depths was holding the Balrog together, and that something was older than the Balrog. This is the lore point that changes everything, and it comes from following the architecture of Tolkien's own cosmology to where it has to lead. Picture this. The year is somewhere in the middle of the Third Age. A dwarf with a pickaxe is working a seam of mithril, 500 feet below anything that has a name, in a tunnel lit only by what his helmet lamp casts. He is following the vein. He has been following it for weeks. It goes down at an angle, steeply, into rock that feels different from what is above. Darker grained, older, colder, in a way that has nothing to do with temperature. The other dwarves have stopped talking. They do not know why. They just have. The sound of the pickaxe feels wrong down here, too loud and too flat at once, as though something is absorbing it. The mithril vein widens. The dwarf follows it. And then below him, where the vein goes deeper still into rock that no instrument they have can date, he feels something, not hears. Feels. A pressure that has nothing to do with the weight of stone above him. A presence in the dark that has been there since before the sun, that registered the sound of his pickaxe the way a sleeper registers a distant door, that is turning, very slowly, in its long dreaming, toward the light. He does not know what he has found. He will be dead within 3 days. That is the story Tolkien wrote between the lines of Moria. The dwarves did not accidentally disturb a Balrog that happened to be sleeping nearby. They broke through into a geological environment that had been functioning as a kind of deep-time preservation system for ancient darkness. A sealed stratum of the world where Melkor's original corruption of the Stone of Arda had never been dispersed, had never been diluted by the long weathering of the ages, had simply remained, concentrated, waiting, because nothing had reached it. And the Balrog was alive in that environment, the way deep-sea creatures are alive in pressure that would crush anything adapted to the surface. It was adapted to the dark. It was sustained by the dark, specifically by this dark, this old and particular darkness. And when the dwarves broke through, they opened that sealed environment to the world above, which brings us to Gandalf, specifically to what Gandalf would have perceived when he entered Moria. Tolkien is precise about the nature of Olorin, which is Gandalf's name in Valinor, before his incarnation as an Istari. In Unfinished Tales, the Istari, Tolkien writes that Olorin's special gift was pity and the capacity to understand the fears and griefs of others. This sounds gentle. It sounds like a counselor's gift, an empathic sensitivity that made him beloved among the elves of Valinor. But think about what that gift actually means for a Maya who is sent to Middle-earth in a physical body that is walking through a world saturated with the residue of ancient corruption. Pity and understanding of suffering and fear are not just emotional capacities. In Tolkien's world, where spirit and matter are not separate but interpenetrating, where the Ainur shaped the world by their thought and their music, where the physical landscape of Arda carries the imprint of the wills that made it, the capacity to perceive suffering and fear is also the capacity to perceive the suffering and fear embedded in the stone. In the corrupted geological layers, in the places where Melkor poured his discord into the bedrock of the world, Gandalf would not just walk into Moria and see a dangerous mine. He would feel it, not metaphorically, literally feel it, the way you feel heat before you see fire, the way you feel the change in air pressure before a storm. The spiritual residue in the stone of those mountains would register to Gandalf as something the other members of the Fellowship could not perceive. They would feel unease. He would feel the full dimensionality of what that unease was pointing toward, and he would know its name. This is the other piece that needs to sit properly before we follow Gandalf into the depths. Tolkien establishes in the cosmological sections of the Silmarillion that the Ainur know each other. Not merely recognize each other, but know each other at the level of original being, the level of the music, the level of who they were before the world was made. The Balrog of Moria was once an Ainur, once a being of the timeless halls, a spirit who sang with the others in the great music before it fell into Melkor's discord and was corrupted. Gandalf would recognize it not merely as a powerful enemy, but as what it was before the fall. He would see it the way you see someone you knew when they were young and good, and what they have become is so completely a destruction of that original person that the recognition itself is a kind of grief. So when Gandalf stood on the bridge of Khazad-dûm and said, "You shall not pass," he was not facing a monster he had never met. He was facing something he knew from before the world, something that had once been of the same order as himself, something whose original face he could still see beneath all the corruption. And he was saying no, not because he was stronger, not because he was certain he could hold the bridge, but because he was the only one present who fully understood what would happen if that thing was allowed to follow them out into the light. That understanding did not come from the moment on the bridge. It came from what Gandalf had already been feeling in Moria, in the miles of tunnels above, in the darkness that pressed against his perception like a weight. He had been reading the stone, and the stone had been telling him how deep the corruption went. Now hold that image, because what comes next is where Gandalf goes further than he intended. Tolkien's account in The White Rider of what happened after the bridge, after Gandalf and the Balrog fell together into the dark below Moria, is one of the most deliberately compressed passages in the entire Lord of the Rings. He survived the fall, he says. He and the Balrog fought in the water at the bottom. Then they went into tunnels, ancient tunnels that had no dwarven markings, because they were older than dwarves. Then they climbed, the Balrog burning, Gandalf following, through caverns, through passages, for days. And here is the specific word Tolkien uses that almost nobody discusses: uttermost. Tolkien writes that they fought far below the uttermost foundations of stone, not just below the deepest tunnels the dwarves had made. Below the uttermost foundations. This is a phrase with cosmological weight in Tolkien's usage. Uttermost is the word he reserves for things that are genuinely terminal, genuinely at the end of a spectrum, genuinely beyond what comes before. The uttermost west, meaning the absolute edge of the world. The uttermost foundations of stone, meaning the geological bottom, the bedrock of Arda itself, the strata that have never been opened, never been worked, never been touched by any hand since the world was made. That is where they fought. Think about what Gandalf, as Olorin, would have experienced in those depths. Picture this: no light, no warmth, the air tasting of something that predates the concept of air as anything breathable, mineral and old and faintly wrong, in a way that is hard to locate, like a smell that triggers the knowledge of danger before the brain can name the source. The walls of the passages down here are not the worked stone of Khazad-dûm. They are not even the unworked stone of the natural mountain. They are something older than the mountain, in its current form, formed before the misty mountains were raised to their present height, when this region of Arda was something different, when Melkor's first and deepest works were being laid down. The stone is darker. It absorbs the light Gandalf makes rather than reflecting it. It does not feel like neutral rock. It feels like rock with a memory, and the memory is not good. Gandalf can feel what is in it. He has no choice. His gift, Olorin's gift, the capacity to understand suffering and fear that lived in the nature of things, it functions down here like a wound held open. Because this stone does not merely contain the neutral geological record of an ancient age, it contains the record of Melkor's working of it, the heats he poured into it, the cold, the deliberate deformation of the music's intended crystalline structure, the will that was put into making these tunnels as instruments of darkness. This stone was made by someone who intended to unmake the world, and Gandalf, whose perception extends into the spiritual character of the things around him, is wading through that intention for 10 days. Not reading about it, not remembering it from the histories of Valinor. Living inside it, surrounded by it, unable to block it out, perceiving it with the full sensitivity of a Maya in a physical body that was designed by the Valar to be responsive to exactly this kind of spiritual reality. That is what the battle beneath Moria actually was. Not just a physical fight. A 10-day immersion in the most concentrated and ancient darkness the physical world contains, in the depths where Melkor's original violation of the music was still intact and unhealed and aware, on some level, that something had come into it that was not of it. The Balrog was almost secondary. The Balrog was what Gandalf was chasing. What the stone around him was is what Gandalf had to survive. And now we have to ask the question that the text does not answer. What did Gandalf learn down there? Here is what the appendices and the letters say about the aftermath. Gandalf was sent back. His task, which had been interrupted by death, was not complete, and the Valar, specifically Manwë, acting with the authority of Ilúvatar, returned him. He woke on the peak of Ziraxigil with no memory of his previous life as Gandalf the Grey, or rather, with those memories but at a distance, as if looking at another person. He was Gandalf the White now, the head of the Order, Saruman's replacement in terms of authority, strengthened in every capacity that mattered. But Tolkien does not say what Gandalf knew that he had not known before. He says Gandalf was returned with all memory of his previous life restored, but what he chose to do with what he had seen in the depths of Moria is never addressed. It is, in fact, conspicuously absent from the narrative. Gandalf the White explains to Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli what happened. He describes the battle. He describes the death and the return. But when he reaches the moment of what he encountered in those deepest passages, the uttermost foundations of stone, he stops. He calls it a darkness and moves on. A darkness. That is all he says about what was in the deepest places of Moria. A darkness. Gandalf, who is never imprecise when precision matters. Gandalf, who gives Frodo a full cosmological explanation of the history of the One Ring when it is necessary for Frodo to understand. Gandalf, who is capable of extraordinary lore depth when he judges that depth necessary. He describes the lowest depths of Moria as a darkness, and he says nothing more. That choice is not accidental. That is a locked door, and Tolkien chose not to give us the key. Now here is where it gets interesting, because Tolkien himself, in his letters, gives us something, not about Moria specifically, about the nature of what remains in the deep places of the world generally. In Letter 212, Tolkien writes about the scars that Melkor left on Arda, and says with unusual directness that those scars are permanent for the life of the world, that they cannot be fully healed within the circles of Arda, that the full restoration of what Melkor damaged must wait for the Dagor-Dagorath, the last battle, when Morgoth himself returns and is finally defeated beyond any recovery, and the world is remade. Until then, the damage is structural. The corruption in the deep stone does not diminish. It does not fade. It waits. Tolkien is explicit that this applies to the physical substrate of Arda. The bones of the world are marred, not metaphorically, literally. The geology of Middle-earth carries Melkor's discord in it, the way a broken bone healed wrong carries the shape of the original fracture. And Gandalf went to the bottom of those bones, and came back and called it a darkness, and moved on. What did he see? What did he feel? What did a Maya with the spiritual sensitivity of Olorin, the capacity to understand suffering and fear at the level of the things themselves, perceive when surrounded for 10 days by the concentrated and unhealed original corruption of Arda at its geological deepest? We are not told. We are given a locked door and no key, and that Tolkien knew perfectly well, is more frightening than any description he could have offered. Because here is the thing about what Tolkien does not say. The omission is the argument. He is not a writer who fails to develop material that matters to him. The Silmarillion is 500 pages of things that matter to him. He developed the music. He developed the nature of Melkor's corruption. He developed the history of the rings in extraordinary detail. He developed Tom Bombadil, past the point any rational narrative economy would have required. When something is left unspoken in Tolkien, it is left unspoken deliberately, either because the characters who know it choose not to say it, or because the narrator, Tolkien in his role as editor of the Red Book, does not have access to it, or because the thing itself is genuinely beyond the capacity of the written word to carry. Gandalf chose not to say it. That much is clear from the text. He was capable of saying more. He had the words. He had the lore. He chose to call it a darkness and close the subject. Why does a man who walked willingly into the fires of Mordor and the throne room of Sauron in his thoughts, and the very presence of the shadow, why does a man like that stop at a particular door and quietly decline to open it? Because some things, when named, become more real than they already are. And what Gandalf found in the uttermost foundations of stone was already real enough. Let us approach this from another angle. Let us look at what changed about Gandalf after Moria, because the changes are specific and they are telling. Gandalf the White is harder than Gandalf the Grey. That is the most obvious observation. He is more direct. He breaks Saruman's staff without ceremony or apparent regret. He overrides Theoden's enchantment with a directness that Gandalf the Grey never showed, a kind of authority that is not quite mercy and not quite ruthlessness, but something between them that has stopped worrying about gentleness. He lies to almost no one in his post-resurrection appearances, but he also volunteers almost nothing. He says what is needed, and he withholds everything else with the calm of someone who has made a decision about what knowledge is safe to share and what must remain sealed. This is usually read as a simple power upgrade. He was Gandalf the Grey. He died and was sent back stronger. He is Gandalf the White now, the head of the Order. Straightforward. But the changes are more textured than a simple strength upgrade would produce. The thing that actually changed is not his power in any direct confrontational sense. It is his economy with truth. Gandalf the White is extraordinarily careful about what he says, extraordinarily careful about what he allows to be known. He manages information the way someone manages a fire in a dry place, feeding it carefully, never letting it get away from him, knowing that the wrong disclosure at the wrong moment could cause damage that no amount of power could repair. That caution looks like wisdom, and it is wisdom, but it is a wisdom forged in a specific experience. Wisdom is always forged in something specific, and what Gandalf experienced in the depths below Moria, the 10 days in the uttermost foundations of stone, is the only candidate for what produced this particular brand of careful, closed, almost claustrophobically controlled wisdom. He knows something that he has decided must not be widely known. And here is where the cosmological architecture becomes important, because there is a principle at work in Tolkien's world that governs this kind of situation. The principle that knowledge of evil, when that knowledge is sufficiently specific and sufficiently close to the source, carries a kind of weight that can itself become dangerous. Not that the knowledge makes the knower evil, but that the knowledge, if shared imprecisely, can give the evil it describes a kind of amplified reality in the minds of those who hear it. Tolkien builds this into the logic of how the rings of power work. The One Ring is more dangerous to the powerful than to the weak, precisely because the powerful have more capacity to receive and channel what the ring offers. Galadriel, offered the ring, imagines with terrible clarity what she would do with it, and the imagination itself is almost a corruption. She has to refuse the vision as much as the ring. The power of dark things in Tolkien's world flows partly through the mind, through the image of what the dark thing is and what it can do. To describe it in full detail is to give it a foothold. Gandalf knows this. He has known it since Valinor, when Olorin was schooled by Nienna in the understanding of suffering and its costs. And what he encountered in the depths below Moria was something that the principle applies to in the most extreme possible degree. He describes it as a darkness, and he moves on. That is not evasion. That is containment. Now return to the question. The first form of it. When Gandalf said he had passed through fire and deep water, was he describing what he survived, or was he warning us about what he left sealed down there? The lore has been building toward an answer. Not a clean answer. Tolkien does not do clean answers, but an answer that has weight, that has earned its weight, that is more than speculation, without being more than what the text can carry. Both. He was doing both. He was describing his experience, and he was, in the only way that was safe, indicating that the experience had content that could not be shared, content that must remain in the depths with the stone that housed it. The warning was embedded in the description. He passed through fire and deep water and came back. He came back changed. He came back as Gandalf the White, and part of what made him white, part of what burned away the grey, was what he saw in the uttermost foundations of stone and chose to carry alone. This is the moment to bring in unfinished tales one more time. The Astari contains a passage that is easy to read as merely biographical context, but which carries enormous weight when placed against the Moria narrative. Tolkien writes that Olorin was sent to Middle-earth reluctantly, not reluctantly as in resentfully, reluctantly as in afraid. He told Manwë he was too weak, that he feared Sauron, that he did not want to go, and Manwë's response, which Tolkien records, is this: "That is indeed why I would send you, for those who are weak in courage shall be strengthened by pity." Fear, met with the capacity to understand it. That is the gift Olorin was given. Not the absence of fear, the ability to make something of fear, to go through it rather than around it, and to come out on the other side carrying the understanding that only those who have been truly afraid can have. That is the pattern of Gandalf's entire existence in Middle-earth. He faces the things he is afraid of, he goes through them, and he comes back having turned the fear into something useful, something that can be given to others, in a form they can receive. Hope, usually, or clarity. Or the specific kind of courage that is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move despite it. The Balrog was the fear he knew going in. The thing in the deep stone was the fear he did not know was there until he arrived. And here is the most extraordinary thing. He went through that one too. He spent 10 days immersed in it, surrounded by it, reading the geological record of Melkor's first and most fundamental violation of Arda with the full perceptual sensitivity of a Maya. And he came back. He came back. Think about what that means. Picture this. The peak of Zirak-Zigil, white sky above, wind sharp and cold and clean after 10 days of no air that deserved the name. Gandalf lying in the snow after the Balrog finally fell, not moving for a long time. Not because he cannot move, but because there is something necessary in the stillness, something that needs to settle, some silt that has been stirred in the 10 days of descent and needs to sink back down to where it will not cloud everything. He does not pray, exactly. He does not know if prayer is the right word for what he does in that silence. But he holds very still, and he allows what he has been through to become not understood exactly, but accepted, held, carried in the way that things which cannot be put down must be carried, with the body, with the whole living weight of himself, as the only alternative to being crushed by them. Then the eagles come, then the green of Lorien, then the long sleep, then the return. And when he wakes, he does not speak of what he saw in the depths. Not to Galadriel, not to the Lady of the Golden Wood, who is perhaps the wisest being left in Middle-earth. He does not speak of it to Aragorn, who will be king. He does not speak of it in any account that reaches the Red Book. He carries it, the way that the world carries it, in the stone of its deepest places, in the geological record of the music that Melkor corrupted before the first sun rose. Gandalf and the world, sharing a secret. Now, the question that this whole architecture has been building toward. Not the first form of it, not the version from the cold open where we were still on the surface, but the version that has earned its weight, the version we can ask now that we have been down in the depths with Gandalf, in the stone, in the uttermost foundations. What if the most frightening thing Gandalf found in the deep places of Moria was not darkness itself, but the realization that the darkness was permanent, not defeated, not diminished by the Third Age, not in decline or retreat or fading, simply there, patient, geological, as real as the stone it lived in and as old as the world's first morning? What if the 10 days below Moria showed Gandalf with absolute clarity that the wound Melkor made in the bones of Arda cannot be healed within the life of the world, that the Dagor Dagorath must come, and the world must be remade entirely before the corruption in the deep stone is resolved? That every victory over darkness in the Third Age, including the defeat of Sauron and the destruction of the One Ring, is a surface victory, a healing of the skin, above a wound that goes all the way to the bone? What if he stood on the peak of Ziraxigil and looked at the world and understood that what he had just survived was not an aberration, not a local concentration of ancient evil that had now been addressed, but a symptom of something systemic, something woven into the physical structure of Arda itself, something that would be there long after the One Ring was unmade and Sauron was dispersed and the Third Age ended and the Fourth Age had run its course? That is a form of knowledge that changes everything and cannot be shared. Not because it would cause despair. Gandalf is too good at hope to allow despair to be the point, but because the full weight of it, the full cosmological enormity of what it means that the world is structurally, geologically, permanently marred until its remaking, cannot be given to a hobbit who needs to carry the ring to Mordor. Cannot be given to a man who needs to believe the war can be won. Cannot be given to anyone who has to live their remaining days inside the world, inside the stone, above the depths that cannot be healed. So Gandalf carries it. He translates it into urgency, into the specific kinds of wisdom that the moment requires, into the driving insistence that Sauron must be defeated now, in this age, before the darkness in the deep stone finds a surface-level expression powerful enough to use it as a foundation rather than a refuge. Because that is the other implication of what Gandalf found in the depths. The Balrog was hiding there, hiding, and being sustained by what it hid in. What if Sauron, had he recovered the ring, had he consolidated his power, had he sent his forces south and north and broken the last resistance of the free peoples, what if Sauron had eventually found a way to use those depths? To reach down into the uttermost foundations of stone and draw on what was there, the ancient and concentrated corruption that Melkor originally poured into the bones of the world, using it as a power source rather than a refuge? Tolkien does not suggest this explicitly, but the cosmological rules he established make it possible. Sauron was Melkor's greatest servant. He knew his master's works. He had been there, in Angband, when the world was young and Melkor's corruption of the deep stone was still ongoing. He knew what was down there. He had not used it yet, because he did not have the power to, because the ring's destruction had forestalled any such culmination. But the potential was real, and the potential required someone to understand it. Gandalf understood it. And the urgency that characterizes everything Gandalf does in The Lord of the Rings, the driving, almost desperate pushing of events toward resolution, while there is still time, the refusal to let the Council of Elrond drift into delay, the insistence on Frodo as ring-bearer, the willingness to die on the bridge of Khazad-dûm rather than let the Balrog follow the Fellowship out, all of it is informed by what he saw in the deep places. By the knowledge that the window for a surface-level victory over the darkness was not infinite, that something was down there, that it was old and patient and permanent, and that the only victory available to the peoples of Middle-earth was the victory of this age, this moment, This specific alignment of courage and chance, and the small person carrying the impossible burden. Not because the deep corruption would be defeated if Sauron fell, but because without Sauron, it would remain what it had been for 5,000 years, sealed, dormant, geological, present but not active, a wound that exists but does not bleed. That was the best available, and Gandalf knew it, and he pushed everything, spent everything, including his first life, to make it possible. The line comes back, "You shall not pass." Not because Gandalf was stronger than the Balrog. He was not certain he was stronger. Not because he was unafraid. He was manifestly, textually, cosmically afraid in that moment. The voice that could shake the bridge of stone, coming from a body that Tolkien describes as shaking with the effort. Because he understood that if the Balrog came through, if the Balrog followed the Fellowship out of Moria and into the world above, the surface-level victory was no longer possible. Not just because of the military threat, because the Balrog was the stone's ambassador to the surface, the living carrier of what was in those depths. And the thing it carried should not come above the line of daylight. Not now. Not while the ring was still in play. Not while there was still a chance. His body on the bridge was a seal, a physical act of containment, of insisting that the depths remain the depths, that the uttermost foundations of stone stay below, that the world above, the world of grass and wind and the light of the sun that Tolkien loved so well, maintain its boundary with what is below. He paid for that containment with his life. He was sent back. He paid for what he saw in the depths, the 10 days in the uttermost foundations, with the version of himself that went down. Gandalf the Grey stayed there. Gandalf the White came back, and the cost of what he saw became the white, the greater clarity and greater authority, and the closed door where the description of the depths should be. He became what the experience required him to become. A person who had been inside the oldest wound in the world and come back and chosen to keep moving, keep working, keep pushing toward the victory that was possible, without speaking of the darkness that was permanent. That is not just wisdom. That is a particular species of love. The love of someone who carries a terrible knowledge in order that the people he loves do not have to. The love that says, "I have been to the bottom of this. I know how deep it goes. And because I know, you do not need to. Your part of it is the ring road and the fire of Orodruin. Mine was the uttermost foundations of stone. His part is done. The story ended. The ring was unmade. Sauron was dispersed. Gandalf went to the Grey Havens with Frodo and the other ring-bearers, and he sailed west. But the stone of the misty mountains is still there. The geological record of Melkor's first working of the world is still there, below the level of any mine that will ever be dug. The wound in the bones of Arda is still there, exactly where it was, exactly as Tolkien described in Letter 212, permanent for the life of the world, requiring the remaking of Arda to resolve. Gandalf left it there. He had no choice. He sealed what he could seal with his body on the bridge, and he fought for what could be fought for in the age that was available, and then he went to the ships and sailed into the west. And the deep places of Middle-earth kept their secret, as they always had. This is what Tolkien actually built. Not just a story of a wizard's death and return, not just a heroic last stand on a narrow bridge. A story about a being with perfect spiritual sensitivity to suffering and corruption descending into the concentrated geological record of the world's original wound and coming back, changed in ways he would never describe, carrying knowledge he would never share, acting with a driven urgency that only makes full sense when you understand what he saw and why it made the current moment the only moment that mattered. The films gave us a warrior's last stand. The lore gives us something harder to look at. A healer who went into the deepest wound in the world and discovered it could not be fully healed. Not in this age. Not in any age that belongs to the current music. Only in the remaking. And he came back from that knowledge and chose to do the work of the age anyway, to fight for the best available victory, to pour everything he was into the specific historical window in which a surface-level defeat of Sauron was possible, not because it solved the deepest problem, because it was the problem that could be solved. And because the people around him needed someone who understood the full depth of the darkness, and could still, after that understanding, get up in the morning and push toward the light. That is the real reason Tolkien modeled Gandalf on Odin, on the wandering god figure, the old man with the hat who walks the roads and appears at need. Not because of the surface resemblance in mythology, because Odin too is a figure who has paid for wisdom with something irreplaceable, who carries knowledge that the other gods do not have and would not want, who sacrifices himself to himself in the world tree and comes back knowing things that cannot be spoken, only acted on. The archetype is the same, the figure who descends into the deepest available darkness and comes back permanently marked by what they found. Gandalf is that figure. Moria is his world tree, and the uttermost foundations of stone are what he hung in. There is a moment in the Return of the King that lands differently once you have followed this thread all the way down. Gandalf is standing on the walls of Minas Tirith, watching the armies of Mordor advance, and he says something that is easy to read as tactical and is actually theological. He says that in all the ages of the world, the servants of darkness have never yet built anything truly lasting, that their fortresses fall, their towers fall, their power fades, because they take from the world rather than giving to it, and what is only taken from is eventually exhausted. He says this with certainty, not with hope, with the certainty of someone who has been to the bottom of what the darkness actually is, and knows, from direct perception, its nature. The darkness in the deep stone of Moria is old. It is patient. It is real. But it is also parasitic in the precise Tolkienian sense. It does not create, it distorts. It does not build, it corrupts. And corruption, however deep it goes, however old it is, however thoroughly embedded in the bones of the world, is still structurally dependent on what it corrupts. The false note in the music requires the music to exist. The wound in Arda requires Arda to exist. Take away the thing being damaged, and the damage has no medium to live in. Gandalf knows this because he spent 10 days inside the damage. He felt the full dimensionality of Melkor's original violation of the music's intended geological form, and what he felt, beneath the horror of it, beneath the ancient and concentrated darkness of it, was its dependence, its need for the rock to corrupt, its inability to exist except as a distortion of what should have been there. The false note cannot sing alone. It needs the music, and the music, the original and intended song of Ilúvatar, is deeper than any damage done to it. That is what gave Gandalf the courage to come back. Not the certainty that the darkness would be defeated, the certainty that it was, at its most fundamental level, derivative, secondary, less real than what it fed on. He was still afraid, he was still shaken, he was still changed in ways he would never describe. But he came back, because he went deep enough to find the bottom of the darkness and discovered that even there, even at the uttermost foundations of stone, the world that Ilúvatar had made was still underneath it, still real, still present, carrying its wound, but not consumed by it. And that, held quietly and not spoken about, was enough to keep moving. When Gandalf said he had passed through fire and deep water, he was describing what he survived. He was indicating what he left sealed. And he was, in the 3 words, fire and deep water, giving to those who would listen carefully the only form in which the truth of those 10 days could be safely handed on, compressed, contained, elliptical, enough for those who already understood, and not enough to harm those who did not. He passed through fire and deep water. The fire was the Balrog. The deep water was the geological dark, where the Balrog had lived for 5,000 years. where Melkor's original making of the mountains had left its signature in the stone, where the uttermost foundations of the world hold their unchanging record of the world's first corruption. The fire went out on the peak of Ziraxigil. The deep water is still there, down in the stone of the misty mountains, below the deepest tunnel any dwarf ever cut, below any name on any map. Patient and permanent and sealed from above, now that the Balrog is gone, and no fool of a Took will try to delve there again. Waiting for the remaking of the world, which Tolkien promises, in the deepest grammar of his cosmology, is coming. And Gandalf sailed west, knowing both of those things, that the wound was still there, and that the healing was coming. Not in his age, not in any age that belongs to the current circles of the world, but coming, in the way that the conclusion of a piece of music is coming from the moment the first note is played, even when the dissonance in the middle seems like it could drown out everything else. He held both of those things, the wound and the promise of healing, as he stood at the prow of the ship and watched Middle-earth recede into the east, and he did not speak about the depths of Moria. He never had. He carried them the way the world carried them, in the deep stone below everything, in the space between what was and what was intended, in the geological record of a note that should not have been played, and the indestructible intention of the music that played on, regardless. So the question, finally, in its full and earned weight, when Gandalf said he had passed through fire and deep water, was he describing what he survived, or was he warning us about what he left sealed down there? He was doing what the great and wounded always do. He was doing both, simultaneously, in the same breath, with the perfect economy of someone who has learned that the most important truths cannot be said plainly without being diminished. He was describing his survival as testimony that the darkness, however deep, however old, however embedded in the bones of Arda, is not final. And he was warning, to those who would listen below the surface of the words, that it is not gone either, that it waits, that it will always wait. In the uttermost foundations of stone, below everything the dwarves built, and everything the elves sang, and everything the men fought for, below all the bright history of the Third Age, there, real, patient, and the world still beautiful above it. That tension, between the wound and the beauty above the wound, between the permanent damage in the deep stone and the light that falls on the Shire on a September morning, between the false note in the music and the music that carries it without being destroyed by it, that is the thing Tolkien spent his entire life writing. Not the battles, not the ring, not even the elves, as much as he loved them. The irreducible tension of a world that is marred and still worth everything, worth the labor of Gandalf the Grey, all those long centuries, worth the 10 days in the dark, worth coming back as Gandalf the White, changed, quieter in certain ways, more precise in others, carrying what he saw and carrying it alone, worth, in the end, every cost. If this question has unsettled you, it should. If you go back to the bridge of Khazad-dûm now and read it with this architecture in mind, you will not hear "you shall not pass" the same way twice. You will hear it as a man sealing a door with the only thing he has left to give, and you will know what was on the other side of the door, not fully, because Tolkien never gave you full, but enough. Enough to feel the weight of the choice, enough to understand that the most terrifying thing about Moria was not the Balrog at all, and it was not the dark, and it was not the depth, but the permanence of what the depth contained, and the question of whether anyone who truly perceived it could still choose to come back. Gandalf did. That is the only answer. That is the whole answer. Leave your own reading in the comments. Where do you think the boundary falls, in Tolkien's world, between what can be healed in time and what must wait for the world's remaking? Whether Gandalf's silence about those depths was mercy, or wisdom, or containment, or all three at once, this is the law that rewards the deepest digging, and this channel is where we go down together. Subscribe if you want to keep descending. there is always further to go.